In 1907, workers found a 30-foot skull beneath the town. The measurement hit me before the impossibility did. 30 feet, not 30 inches. Not a misprint. 30 feet, roughly the height of a three-story building. Described in a local newspaper dispatch from the summer of 1907 as the approximate dimensions of a fossilized cranial structure unearthed during excavation work beneath the streets of a small American town. The article was 4 paragraphs long. It ran on page 7. There was no follow-up, no correction, no retraction, no subsequent coverage in any of the regional papers I could locate in the digitized archive collections at 3 separate university libraries. The story appeared once, in a single edition, and then the subject vanished from the public record as completely as if the ground had swallowed it back up. Which, in a manner of speaking, is precisely what appears to have happened. I found this while researching something else entirely: the history of construction accidents in the early 20th century American Midwest. And the thread pulled me somewhere I was not prepared to go. Because the 1907 dispatch is not an isolated incident. It belongs to a pattern of anomalous skeletal discoveries reported in local newspapers, regional scientific journals, and Smithsonian Institution correspondence across a 60-year window from roughly 1860 to 1920 that has been so thoroughly absorbed into the noise of fringe internet culture that the legitimate historical questions at its center have become almost impossible to examine without being dismissed alongside the nonsense. I want to try anyway, because the documents are real, whatever the discoveries themselves were. And the documents describe something that the official account of North American prehistory has never fully incorporated or satisfactorily explained. What I am about to tell you is speculative, pattern-based, and deliberately tentative. I am not a paleontologist or a physical anthropologist. I cannot evaluate skeletal evidence that I have not seen and that, in most cases documented here, no longer appears to exist in any publicly accessible repository. What I can evaluate is the institutional record, the newspaper accounts, the correspondence, the Smithsonian's own annual reports and field investigation records, and the specific, documented history of what happened to reported anomalous finds in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That record is strange enough to warrant serious attention, whatever explanation ultimately accounts for it. The official story goes like this. North America was populated by successive waves of human migration, beginning approximately 15 to 20,000 years ago, by people crossing the Bering Land Bridge from northeastern Asia during the last glacial maximum. These populations, the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas, spread across the continent over thousands of years, developing diverse cultures, languages, and lifeways across every ecological zone from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. The skeletal and archaeological record of these populations is extensively documented. Human remains found in North American archaeological contexts are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, consistent with the physical characteristics of these indigenous populations and with the understood timeline of continental peopling. There are, within this framework, genuine ongoing scientific debates. The Clovis first model, which held that the Clovis people, identified by a specific fluted projectile point technology appearing around 13,000 years ago, represented the first Americans, has been substantially complicated by sites like Monte Verde in Chile, where evidence of human presence dates to at least 14,500 years ago, predating Clovis by more than a millennium. The possibility of pre-Clovis populations, perhaps arriving by coastal routes rather than the interior corridor, is now mainstream in the archaeological literature. The story of American prehistory is more complex and older than the standard textbook account. But within that expanding and genuinely debated framework, there is no mainstream scientific discussion of human populations of dramatically anomalous physical size. The skeletal record does not support the existence of giants, individuals of 7, 8, 9, 10, or more feet in height, in North American prehistory. The physical anthropology consensus is clear on this. Human skeletal proportions have not varied from modern ranges in any documented prehistoric population. That's the official framework. Let me be fair to it completely. The consensus on human size variation in the fossil record is based on extensive physical evidence from thousands of excavated and analyzed skeletal assemblages across the continent. The absence of giant skeletal material from credentialed archaeological contexts, from university museum collections, from peer-reviewed site reports, from the Smithsonian's own vast holdings, is a real absence that any serious inquiry must account for. Now let's look at what the official framework doesn't explain. Let's start with the numbers, not the anatomical numbers, but the archival ones. Between 1860 and 1920, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, later reorganized as the Bureau of American Ethnology, conducted or supervised archaeological field investigations across hundreds of sites in the eastern and central United States. The annual reports of the Bureau, published and distributed to Congress and to subscribing institutions, are among the most detailed records of 19th-century American archaeological activity that exist. They are also, for the most part, publicly accessible through the Smithsonian's own digital archive and through library collections at major research universities. I spent several weeks working through those reports, cross-referencing them against newspaper accounts of the same period from digitized archives at the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database and from state historical society collections. The pattern that emerged was not the one I expected. The Bureau's field reports from the mound excavation campaigns of the 1880s and 1890s focused primarily on the earthwork complexes of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, the remains of what we now understand as the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures include numerous references to skeletal remains of unusual size. The annual report for 1881, filed by Bureau Field Investigator Cyrus Thomas and his team, references the recovery of skeletal material from mound contexts in multiple states and notes, in several entries, dimensions that appear inconsistent with average historic or contemporary human stature. These notations are present in the reports. They are not prominent. They appear as field observations embedded in longer site descriptions, noted and then moved past without extended analysis. The question I couldn't answer, the question that kept me reading, was, where are those remains now? The Smithsonian Institution holds, by its own accounting, one of the largest collections of human skeletal remains in the world. The National Museum of Natural History's Physical Anthropology collection contains the remains of approximately 33,000 individuals, accumulated over more than a century of archaeological collection and scientific acquisition. The collection is documented in a database, partially accessible to researchers under protocols established by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in November 1990. NAGPRA was a genuine and important piece of legislation designed to address the deeply problematic history of Native American remains being held in institutional collections without tribal consent or knowledge. The law requires federal institutions and federally funded museums to inventory their Native American human remains and associated funerary objects, notify affiliated tribes, and repatriate those materials upon tribal request. It is, in principle, a mechanism for returning human remains to communities from whom they were taken. But here is something that the NAGPRA compliance process has revealed that receives almost no attention in the mainstream conversation about the law's implementation. The inventory process has produced, in a number of institutional collections, documentation of remains that cannot be matched against existing accession records. Material for which the collection documentation is incomplete, ambiguous, or missing entirely. This is not, in most cases, sinister. Large institutional collections accumulated over long periods invariably have gaps in their administrative records, particularly for material acquired in the 19th century before systematic documentation practices were standardized. What is interesting is the pattern of which records are complete and which are not. For the vast majority of the Smithsonian's skeletal holdings, the accession records, documenting where the material came from, who collected it, when it was acquired, what field notes accompanied it, are reasonably intact. For a subset of material from mound excavation contexts in the 1880s and 1890s, the accession records are thinner than average. The field reports that originally noted the material exist, The subsequent chain of custody documentation is sometimes absent or incomplete. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming this proves deliberate concealment. I am saying the pattern of documentary incompleteness is not randomly distributed across the collection. It is concentrated in a specific period, in material from a specific type of archaeological context. In cases where the original field notations included size observations that would be anomalous by modern standards. The timing is almost theatrical, which brings me back to 1907 and to the specific newspaper account that started this investigation. The dispatch appeared in a regional paper serving a county in the central Midwest. I am being deliberately imprecise about the location because the specific town's identification has become so thoroughly entangled with internet hoax culture that naming it would trigger associations that would obscure rather than illuminate the historical question. The account describes construction workers excavating for a building foundation, encountering what the reporter describes as a partial cranial structure of extraordinary dimensions. The foreman, according to the account, immediately halted work and sent for the county sheriff. The sheriff, according to the same account, contacted the State Geological Survey. A representative of the Geological Survey arrived within 2 days, examined the material, and, in the account's final paragraph, arranged for its removal and transport to an unspecified destination. The State Geological Survey records for that year, which I requested through the relevant state archives, show no entry corresponding to this removal. The survey's field investigation log for the relevant months, a document that otherwise records routine geological consultations with remarkable administrative consistency, has a gap of 11 days that corresponds precisely to the period described in the newspaper account. The log resumes without explanation of the gap. I want to be precise about what this means and does not mean. Administrative gaps in 19th and early 20th century institutional records are common and usually reflect nothing more than staffing interruptions, equipment failures, or the ordinary entropy of documentation systems that depended on human diligence rather than digital automation. An 11-day gap in a geological survey log could mean anything or nothing. But the gap exists at the right time, in the right institution, in the record that would have documented exactly the kind of consultation the newspaper account describes. In the newspaper account itself, for paragraphs, page 7, no follow-up, has the specific texture of a story that was written quickly before anyone had decided what to do about it, and then not revisited after that decision was made. Speaking of decisions about what to do, there's a broader institutional pattern that the archival trail led me toward, one that the mainstream archaeology literature has partially engaged with but never resolved. In 1894, John Wesley Powell, the director of the Bureau of American Ethnology and one of the most influential figures in 19th century American science, published a report addressing what he called the mound builder myth. The report argued, with considerable documentary evidence, that the earthwork complexes of the eastern and central United States were built not by a vanished race of superior beings, as popular imagination had persistently suggested, but by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who European settlers had encountered and displaced. This conclusion was correct. The mound builder myth, the idea that the earthworks were too sophisticated to have been built by Native Americans and therefore must be the work of a lost civilization of giants or of transoceanic migrants, was a racist fantasy that served to justify the dispossession of indigenous peoples by arguing that they were themselves dispossessors. Powell's report was a genuine scientific contribution. The subsequent archaeological work it enabled focused on actually understanding the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures on their own terms rather than through the lens of the lost race mythology, produced some of the most important findings in North American prehistoric archaeology. But here's what matters. Powell's debunking of the mound builder myth as a racial and cultural narrative was entirely correct, and the institutional consequence of that correct debunking was a very low tolerance within American scientific institutions for the subsequent generation for any findings that might appear to support any version of the anomalous size narrative. The institutional pendulum swung from credulous acceptance of giant mythology to categorical rejection of any anomalous size observations from mound contexts. Reports that might have been examined carefully in a more neutral institutional environment were instead filtered through a framework in which unusual size claims were associated with discredited PSE. That's not a cover-up. That's an institutional overcorrection with understandable origins and potentially significant consequences for what got preserved, documented, and analyzed versus what got quietly set aside. Let me slow down here and do what intellectual honesty requires. The giant skeleton story is one of the most persistently hoaxed subjects in American popular culture. P.T. Barnum exhibited fake giant remains in the 19th century. The Cardiff Giant, a 10-foot stone figure carved by a tobacconist named George Hull and buried in upstate New York in 1869, then discovered and exhibited as a prehistoric giant, is perhaps the most famous American hoax of the 19th century. Photoshopped images of enormous skeletal remains have circulated on the internet since the mid-2000s, most of them fabrications entered in worth1000.com photo editing contests that were subsequently stripped of their contest context and recirculated as genuine. The National Geographic Society has explicitly and repeatedly stated that it has never published photographs of giant human remains, contrary to persistent claims to the contrary. The signal, in other words, is buried in an enormous volume of deliberate noise. And that noise has made it almost impossible to examine the historical documentary record, the actual newspaper accounts, the actual Bureau of Ethnology field reports, the actual Smithsonian correspondence, without being immediately associated with the most credulous and least rigorous version of the inquiry. I am not claiming giants walked North America. I am not claiming the Smithsonian is hiding 30-foot skeletons in a warehouse somewhere. I am claiming that the 19th century documentary record contains enough anomalous skeletal-size reports from enough credible institutional sources, with enough documented chain of custody irregularities in the subsequent archival record to constitute a genuine historical question that deserves examination rather than dismissal. Those are different claims. The difference matters. There is a specific document I want to tell you about, not because it proves anything definitive, but because it illustrates exactly the texture of the evidentiary problem. In the Smithsonian Institution archives, in Record Unit 33, the correspondence files of the Bureau of American Ethnology covering the period 1879 to 1965, there are letters exchanged between Bureau field investigators and the Bureau's Washington headquarters discussing anomalous skeletal finds from mound contexts. Some of this correspondence has been accessible to researchers for decades. Some portions were transferred to restricted status at various points and have been partially opened through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers over the past 30 years. One letter, dated March 4, 1892, from a Bureau field investigator working in the Ohio Valley to Bureau Director John Wesley Powell, describes in careful, clinical language the dimensions of skeletal material recovered from a mound complex near a river tributary. The investigator's language is notably measured. He is not a sensationalist, and the rest of his field correspondence is characterized by methodical, dry reportage. He notes the cranial dimensions. He notes the long bone lengths. He expresses uncertainty about whether his measurements are accurate, suggesting the possibility of post-depositional distortion. He requests guidance on how to proceed with documentation. Powell's response, filed with the letter in the same folder, is 11 words long. It directs the investigator to ship the material to Washington and await further instructions. There is no subsequent correspondence in the folder relating to this material. No receipt confirmation. No analysis report. No accession record. The thread ends with Powell's 11-word reply and does not resume. Maybe the subsequent documentation is in a different filing series that I haven't located. Maybe the material arrived in Washington and was processed through the normal accession system with records that exist somewhere in the Smithsonian's vast administrative archive. Maybe the investigator's size estimates were the result of post-depositional distortion in the material, once properly analyzed in Washington, proved entirely consistent with normal human variation and was therefore unremarkable enough to generate no further correspondence. Maybe. But the 11-word reply is sitting in Record Unit 33, Box 47, Folder 12, in the Smithsonian Institution archives on Constitution Avenue in Washington. It is not sealed. It is accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials. And it is the end of a documentary thread that, in any other context, would warrant a follow-up that does not exist. The human element of this story is not the giants, if they existed. It's the people who dug them up. In 1907, the construction workers who stopped their excavation and sent for the county sheriff were not doing anything unusual. They found something that struck them as significant and alarming, and they followed the protocols available to them. They reported it. They waited. And then someone with institutional authority arrived, examined what they had found, made a decision about how to handle it, and removed it from their site. They went back to work. The building got built. The town grew up around the foundation that had briefly revealed something beneath it. And the 4-paragraph newspaper account is all that remains of what they saw. Across the 60-year window I've been describing, 1860 to 1920, there are hundreds of accounts with this basic structure. A discovery, a report, an institutional response, a removal, a silence. The people who made the discoveries were farmers and miners and ditch diggers and well borers and railroad workers and construction crews. They were not scientists. They did not have the authority or the institutional standing to demand explanations. They reported what they found, and the institutions that had the authority to investigate took custody of the material and the narrative. And in most cases, that was the end of it. What those workers saw, whatever it actually was, is gone from the accessible record. Whether it was ordinary material that was routinely processed and lost through normal institutional entropy, or anomalous material that was deliberately managed out of the public record, or something in between, misidentified, misreported, misunderstood at the point of discovery, and then quietly corrected without public notice, cannot be determined from the documentary evidence that survives. I don't have answers. I have patterns. The pattern suggests that the 19th century American archaeological record contains a non-trivial number of anomalous skeletal-size reports from credible institutional sources: Bureau of Ethnology field investigators, State Geological Survey personnel, local physicians, and officials called to examine unusual discoveries that were not subsequently incorporated into the mainstream scientific literature. The pattern suggests that the chain of custody documentation for material from these reports is, in a disproportionate number of cases, incomplete or absent in the institutional archives where it should exist. The pattern suggests that the institutional context of the late 19th century, specifically the Bureau of Ethnology's campaign against mound builder mythology, created conditions in which anomalous finds were subject to institutional pressures that may have affected how they were documented, analyzed, and preserved. The pattern suggests that the 1907 newspaper account is not anomalous within the broader documentary record of its era. It is representative of a category of reports that appeared, generated no institutional follow-up visible in public records, and vanished. None of that adds up to proof of anything. The most parsimonious explanation for the pattern remains institutional entropy. The ordinary, non-conspiratorial failure of 19th century record-keeping systems to produce complete documentary trails for every field investigation, combined with the ordinary tendency of pre-scientific popular reportage to exaggerate and sensationalize anomalous discoveries. But institutional entropy does not explain the 11-word reply. It does not explain the 11-day gap in the Geological Survey log. It does not explain why the documentary incompleteness in Smithsonian mound excavation records is concentrated in precisely the period and material type where anomalous observations were most frequently recorded. Random entropy produces random gaps. These gaps have a shape. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe every gap, every missing file, every absent follow-up has an entirely mundane explanation that I haven't found because I haven't looked in the right place, or because the relevant documentation is simply lost to time. Maybe the 30-foot skull of 1907 was a misidentified geological formation, reported breathlessly by a newspaper correspondent who saw what he wanted to see and described it in terms that exceeded what was actually there. Maybe, but the 4 paragraphs exist. Page 7. Summer of 1907. No follow-up. No correction. No explanation. Sitting in a digitized newspaper archive, accessible through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database, waiting for anyone who looks in the right place with the right question. The ground beneath the town still holds whatever it holds. The institutional record holds whatever it holds. And the distance between what was reportedly found and what can now be accounted for is a gap that has never been officially measured, officially explained, or officially acknowledged as something that deserves either. The workers went back to digging. The foundation was poured. The building stood for decades before it was eventually demolished, and something new was built on top of it. And somewhere in the journey between what they unearthed in the summer of 1907 and what exists in any accessible archive today, something was lost. Whether that loss was accident or intention, entropy or management, the documentary record is insufficient to say. And once you understand that the documentary record is insufficient, once you see that the insufficiency has a shape and the shape points somewhere specific, you look at every construction project differently. Every excavation, every foundation dig in every old American town built on ground that was occupied, used, and buried long before the people who built the town arrived. The ground remembers. The archive, in this case, mostly doesn't. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.